Reigning in Iran, Saudi Arabia hosts 3 summits calling for action against Tehran as Riyadh accuses its rival of threatening regional order. But beyond such high-level meetings, what can Saudi Arabia do? Does it have enough support? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. Welcome to Inside Story. An emergency requiring 3 consecutive summits in the one location. It certainly sounds like something that needs to be addressed and quickly. And according to Saudi Arabia, the emergency is Iran. The kingdom gathered Arab leaders for meetings of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Arab League and the Organisation of Islamic Countries, and said the international community must, quote, use all means to stop Iran from interfering in other countries' affairs. Question is, though, is there an emergency? Or is this another power play in the Gulf with the addition of a US military presence? We'll discuss that and more with our panel in a moment. First, this report from Hashim Al-Bara.
A rare, cordial moment between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Qatar's Prime Minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Nasser bin Khalifa Al Thani, greeted by Saudi King Salman bin ABDULAZIZ in Mecca. The kingdom is hosting emergency meetings of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Organisation of the Islamic Conference and the Arab League to counter what they say is Iran's growing influence. But the Saudis, who are eager to show they have wider backing, face a daunting task, ending the blockade imposed on Qatar since 2017. The Qatari Prime Minister is seen here shaking hands with the King of Bahrain, another blockading country, and then the Kuwaiti Emir steps in trying to bring the Saudi King and Qatari Prime Minister to engage in further talks that might ease tension and bring harmony to a GCC in disarray. King Salman made it clear in his opening speech that he sees Iran as the biggest threat to stability in the region.
The Iranian regime interfered in our internal affairs and developed ballistic and nuclear weapons. It affects navigation and international oil. This is a naked aggression against our stability and international security.
But for the Saudis to build a coalition against Iran, they need to end the impasse created by the GCC crisis. The diplomatic spat started when Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE and Egypt severed ties with Qatar, imposed a land, sea and air blockade. The blockading quartet accused Qatar of supporting extremism, accusations strongly dismissed by Qatari government. Kuwait is mediating in the conflict, and the US is concerned the feud might undermine its efforts to isolate Iran and defeat ISIL in the Middle East.
The strategy is flawed from the GCC states. Flawed because in one sense, they don't want to talk to Iran. Iran has asked for a dialogue, and they don't want to sit on the table and talk to Iran and sort out all the issues that we have with Iran. On the other hand, they are, instead of uniting and unifying the Gulf region to stand as a bloc, a solid bloc, they are actually dividing it into different countries. They are disintegrating the regional organization, the GCC. There are conflicts within, between the GCC member states, the blockade against Qatar. So you can't have one group standing against Iran if you want to push back in one sense. And this group is disunited and disfragmented.
At the end of the meetings, the GCC and the Arab League expressed support for Saudi Arabia against what they described as Iran's destabilizing activities in the region. A diplomatic boost for Saudi Arabia, but also a prelude to more tension in the region. Hashim Al-Bara, Al Jazeera.
So let's meet the panel for today. 2 of our guests are here in Doha. With me in the studio is Majed Al-Ansari, who is a professor of political science at Qatar University. We have also got Abdallah Al-Shayji, a professor of political science from Kuwait University. And in Tehran, Hassan Ahmadi, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Tehran. Welcome to all of you, 3 professors on the show. So let's get into it. Majed, let me start with you. I mentioned this in my setup a little bit earlier, the emergency, and I am using air quotes there because there seems to be this premise of we need 3 summits right now to deal with this emergency. Is it an emergency, or is this in fact a way of almost creating the feeling of an emergency?
Yeah, first of all, let's just clarify one thing, which is that 2 of the summits were emergency summits.
Okay.
The Islamic summit is a normal summit. It's just a procedural issue. Yeah.
Okay.
But certainly, the 3 summits are held consecutively in a show of emergency, if you will, because it was very clear for the Saudis that they needed to prompt up the situation between the United States and Iran and provide some lip service for the American agenda in the region. Of course, what the Saudis were not banking on, or the Emiratis, is that the White House would change its position so quickly, because the White House went from calling for war with Iran to basically now the ExxonMobil staff going back to work on Sunday in Iraq. So there's absolutely no sign of any tension now, a real tension between the 2 countries.
Is there still not a bit of ambiguity, though? I mean, the classic from the Trump administration of mixed messages. Bolton says one thing, Trump says the other thing, and we never quite know what the official line is.
Yeah, I think, if we look at the pattern of behavior when it comes to the Trump administration, it's very clear that this issue now has been treated exactly like the North Korean deal. So you can see it very clearly, start with escalation, threatening, talking about even, I think what Trump said in the UN was, I think, obliterating all of North Korea.
Total destruction of North Korea.
Total destruction of North Korea. Now, the same thing has been said about Iran, but also, as what happened with North Korea, then he started praising the leader of North Korea and then asking for the summit and then holding the summit and then not really caring what happens after the summit, to be honest, because it's all a political win for Trump. The same thing is what the White House now wants from Iran. It's very clear that the Iranians are more stubborn. They're not going to get into bed easily with the Americans just over a photo shoot. And right now, the Saudis and the Emiratis are left high and dry without any real agenda in the region towards what's going to happen. It's very clear that when it comes to the military, the U.S. is not prepping up for war. When it comes to how it's dealing with its citizens and its companies in the region, it's not prepping up for war. But the Saudis and the Emiratis now are left with a summit that is basically only condemnation of the acts that took place during the last month, but with really no procedure to deal with it in the future.
Even so, let's talk about that condemnation. And Abdullah Al-Shayji, I'll bring you in at this point. Tell me what your thoughts were on the language, particularly of King Salman, the way he said, we will use all means to stop Iran, Iran's criminal acts, naked aggression against our stability. It was all quite aggressive language, really.
Exactly. I mean, we have to look at this issue or the summits, the 2 emergency summits that were held last night and until dawn, as a part of the ongoing Cold War mentality and practice that has been the norm, the new norm, since 2016 at least, when Saudi Arabia severed ties with Iran and other GCC countries followed suit, especially Bahrain and also other GCC, even Qatar and Kuwait withdrew their ambassadors and lowered their diplomatic representation in Tehran. So what's going on is that this is another salvo of pushing back by the Saudis, the leader of the GCC, to send a message to the Iranians, especially after the last spat of bombings, of the threatening, as King Salman stated very clearly at the opening statement, that Iran is responsible for the shenanigans and for what's taking place to undermine security and stability in the region. The heightened tension is because of the escalation of rhetoric between the United States and Iran. And now we have de-escalation. And from day one, I said there is no war in this region, but it's just part of the Trump administration flexing its muscles to gain some credence and some votes among his staunch voters and his base, to rally his base, as the Americans keep saying. So the condemnation was expected. The Saudis are trying, along with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, to try to, who are the 3 hawks. We have hawks and doves in the GCC, and the hawks are now taking the stage, and they're trying to send a message to the Iranians, to their constituencies, and to the Americans that we are standing tough against the Iranians. And there was wide condemnation although it was not reflected in the speeches on the other summit, emergency summit, the Arab League summit, but it was clearly in the final communique that there is a strong condemnation of Iranian behaviors. Iran has brought this upon itself for supporting proxies, for fomenting sectarianism, and for pushing the region into the abyss. So it's clearly the message was clear, sent by the communique, the Arab final communique, the Arab Summit final communique, and before it, the GCC final communique also.
So is this, Abdullah, the Saudis, as you describe all that condemnation, is this the Saudis almost taking the baton from the United States? As Majed said, the United States slightly backing down a little bit. Is this the Saudis taking the baton and saying, right, we will now lead the charge against Iran, and US, if you want to support us, come along?
That case, because the perplexing issue that there were no beyond condemnation of Iranian behavior, which was and practice, which was expected, was the issue of what are the practical measures that will be taken by the GCC leaders and by the Arab leaders to put in practice this condemnation, translated from condemnation to a practical approach to try to push Iran to change its behavior. I mean, this is the issue. No regime change. And then there is contradiction by the United States. And this is what's really puzzling. Pompeo, about a year ago, stipulated the 12 conditions on the Iranians that they should really adhere to in order for the Americans and the Iranians to strike a deal. In Tokyo, President Trump, a few days ago, just obliterated all of that and erased it, and he just stated one point, and that is Iran should not become a nuclear power. And the Ayatollah Khamenei stated clearly that there is the Iranian approach and the Iranian policy and edict is that it's against Islam to have a nuclear arsenal. So the standstill is ongoing, but what are the conditions? What is really the United States strategy vis-a-vis Iran? Is it the 12 points stated by Pompeo, or it is the 1 point about the nuclear issue stated by Trump? So there is a lot of confusion, and then you throw in Bolton here, and then you have more confusion regarding how to deal with Iran from the American perspective, and leaving their allies puzzled really about what is the end game of the Americans here.
Let's see then what Hassan Ahmadian has to say in Tehran, bring you into the conversation. Maybe not so much the reaction that we've heard from the Iranian officials, but what you think about how they've interpreted this, as Abdullah was saying, the 12 points versus the 1 point, the slight backing down from the US, the aggression from Saudi Arabia.
Of course, I think the Iranian reading of this, all of this, saber rattling on the part of the United States, is that they don't have a coherent, consistent policy. They only want, to push, to maximize the pressure on Iran to see afterwards what will come up. I mean, there are, of course, Iran hawks in Washington who are advocating war or a military attack on Iran, but in general, there is no consistency, there is no coherence in there. With regards to Saudi Arabia and the summits, the emergency summits, there's nothing emergent about them from what I hear in Tehran. It's basically what the Saudis want to call emergent. Actually, it's part of the maximum pressure. Whenever the escalation decreases in the region, there is de-escalation in the region on the part of the United States and Iran. Saudis try to, feed the fire and put some fuel on it. And I think this policy is part of it is, bringing back the maximum pressure on Iran, and part of it is to push back against Iran's diplomatic outreach in the region. Iran's contact with its neighbors, the Gulfis, Pakistan, Iraq, trying to, de-escalate the situation in the region has a lot to do with what Saudi Arabia did last night.
So bottom line then, Hassan,
the Saudis are looking at Trump as an opportunity.
Will Iran be worried? Or how worried will Iran be? Or in the end, does Iran, regardless of who signed a communique and who didn't, do they know who their friends are? They know who they can trust. They'll carry on as they were.
Of course. I mean, Saudi Arabia basically divided the region into two camps. It doesn't, basically going there and sitting and listening to what King Salman has to say doesn't mean that you agree with him. Even the closest alliance that Saudi Arabia had during the past, decade or during the basically 4 decades was the GCC. And within the GCC, as Abdullah mentioned, there are the hawkish attitude towards Iran, and there are the doves who don't want an escalation with Iran. On top of them, Qatar under blockade, Kuwait and Oman who basically are trying to de-escalate the situations. Practically, they are going against Saudi's official line of escalation on Iran, about going against Saudi's opportunism against Iran with regards to Trump, because they see Trump as an opportunity. And I think their policy will continue the way it is until they exhaust the Trump variable with regards to Iran.
Majed, the way that Hassan has talked to us there about the camps, the way Saudi Arabia, he says, has divided them, can you just elaborate on that a little for our viewers and remind us who's on whose side, basically, or maybe more the point I'm making in the end, when push comes to shove, if push comes to shove, who will back Saudi Arabia?
Well, at the moment, there are very few states that are in line with Saudi Arabia's foreign policy initiatives in the Arab world. We've seen very clearly that the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Haftar in Libya, maybe the new military council in Sudan, are probably the only countries where you'd find real support for any Saudi initiatives. And even in that case, I'm skeptical about how much of support the Saudis can get from these countries. It was seen very clearly in the blockade on Qatar, for example. The Saudis wanted to rally all the Arab and Muslim world against Qatar, but they ended up rallying a very small number of states. Most of them backed out of the blockade very, very early on in the crisis. But also, it's very important here to note that the Saudis were banking on their efforts being a sideshow of American aggression towards Iran. They didn't bank on the idea that the Americans would back out very, very quickly like this. And this is why I said before that they were left high and dry in this. It's not, now these summits are in the rearview mirror. You've seen the declarations that came out of it, the communiques at the end. Even the countries who were attending the meeting, Iraq at least, voices concern that it was not part of the writing the communique and designing what will be included in it. But Palestine asked for another sentence to be added. It was never added. And it was very clear that a lot of the statements by the leaders were not in line with what the Saudis wanted to hear and were not in line with the actual official communique that ended the summit, which makes it very clear that this summit is basically a courtesy to Saudi Arabia. Attendance is a courtesy to Saudi Arabia and not real support for any Saudi initiative towards Iran.
Just quickly, before I go back to Abdullah, you mentioned the Gulf crisis in Qatar. How important was it that the Prime Minister of Qatar did go?
I don't think it's significant in the crisis itself. It's very clear that there was no initiative that resulted in the Prime Minister going. I think for Qatar it was very clear. They received a proper invitation this time, as opposed to what happened in the previous summits. And also, Qatar is attempting with its partners in Kuwait and Oman and Iraq and other countries to rationalize politics in the region, to rationalize political behavior in the region. And also, Qatar has always risen above bilateral differences when it came to regional issues, Arab and Islamic, GCC and Arab and Islamic issues. So I think it was very clear why the Prime Minister was there. And the lack of any enthusiasm from the other side and from the Qatari side towards talking about the GCC makes it very clear that there is no advancement in that crisis.
Right. Abdullah, let me come back to you. I actually want to discuss a couple of other things that weren't discussed. Everything was Iran, Iran, Iran. The fact that Yemen was not discussed at a meeting of Arab League and GCC, I think is quite something. And it's, as I understand, the leaders were even given a tour of almost like a little museum when they arrived. They were shown drones and missiles from Yemen that had been destroyed and almost like showing off, and then didn't discuss what is the greatest humanitarian crisis in the region.
Yeah, but Yemen was discussed in a way through the Houthis. There was also wide condemnation of the Houthis, who everybody knows is a very effective arm of Iran. And even the museum that the Saudis showed the leaders of the GCC and Arab states were all made in Iran. I mean, the problem and the ounce, once again, we go back and state that lays on the Iranian side. Iran has really to change its behavior. What's dividing the GCC, not only the Saudi Arabia, UAE / policy, but also the practice and the behavior and propping up Iran's proxies in 4 Arab countries. Iran brags all the time that they control 4 Arab capitals. And this is really undermining not only the GCC solidarity and security and stability, but the whole Arab region. Iran wants to be the hegemonic player in the region. Iran believes that it is entitled to this role because it has the power, it has the influence, it has the proxies, and it has invested heavily on its proxies in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Yemen, and it has really infiltrated with the sleeping cells and terrorist cells that were discovered, also helped by the Iranian embassies, especially in Kuwait. A few years ago, we discovered the largest and the most dangerous terrorist cell that was funded, supported, trained, and ideologued by the Iranians. So Iran's behavior has really to be looked again, revisited, and because Iran is really under a heavy crunch. Now the Americans are pushing very hard for Iran to have zero oil export. Brian Hook stated that we have deprived Iran of $50 billion. This is disastrous for Iran in order to cripple Iranian economy, in order to foment internal stability, even though President Trump stating that the Americans' policy is not, or objective is not to overthrow the Iranian regime, but the hidden agenda here is that
Abdullah, can I interrupt you?
Fomenting troubles and instability will push the Iranian regime to collapse.
I'm sorry, Abdullah, I'm going to interrupt you because I want to bring Hassan back in. We are starting to run down on time here. Anything you want to react to there with this? As we say, you know, I started talking about Yemen there, but as Abdullah said, it all seems to turn back to Iran by the end of it.
Of course, not the way Abdullah describes. I think Iran is a relevant episode of it, but it's not the entire picture. I think Saudi Arabia, I mean, he's talking about Yemen as if Yemen just erupted without any causes. There are causes for that. There is, you know, $6 billion worth of missiles and bombs dropped on the Yemenis. And as soon as, you know, a low-tech, you know, drone crosses the border, you would hear the Saudi outcry that these are, you know, Iranian proxies, whereas they are indigenous Yemenis defending themselves against a foreign invader of their country. That's the way it is. They are killing Yemenis, and Yemenis are reacting. And the more, the longer the situation, you know, lasts, I think the Yemeni reactions will increase. That has been the trend. With regards to other issues, there are, you know, different views, totally different from what Abdullah said. I mean, in the region, you know, who went to Syria to topple the government there? Who destabilized Iraq? They are all offshoots of Saudi thinking, you know, the Salafi jihadis, terrorists who go there and sow chaos in these regions to dominate these states. Who, you know, detained a head of state, the Lebanese prime minister, in his capital? Who waged a war, devastating war on Yemen? Who blockaded another neighbor of his? I mean, it's not Iran. People tend to, you know, simplify the picture by pointing, yeah, that's the justification for our irrationality here. But I think the irrationality is there in Riyadh. Adventurism started in 2015 with Mohammed bin Salem's taken over. He waged wars, he waged, you know, he detained people, he killed a lot of people, he blockaded countries.
Right.
And then, after doing all these irrational behaviors, he then started thinking, then what next? Let's justify it with Iran. I mean, bring in some heads of states and say it's an emergency because Iran did this and that. Is simple for Riyadh,
Hassan,
but it's not going to solve its problems.
I hate doing this. We're out of time. I'm so sorry. Hassan Ahmadi in Tehran, Abdullah Al-Shayji here in Doha, and of course Majed Al-Ansari with me here as well. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for joining us as well. This programme is available online, of course, at aljazeera.com, along with all our other episodes. You can connect with us at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story as well. You can go to Twitter at AJ Inside Story, and I'm at Kamahl AJE if you want to tweet me directly. Thanks for your company this week on Inside Story, and we will see you again soon.